press room is packed. The air is thick with calculating whispers, and the flash of cameras lights up incessantly from dozens of lenses. They aren't here just to report. They're here with a clear purpose: to exploit, distort, or reinforce the narrative they've already crafted in their minds. Karoline Leavitt stands behind the podium, her hands lightly resting on the edge of the table, her gaze sharp but calm. Inside her burns not an explosive anger, but a smoldering fire, the resolve of someone who has grown all too familiar with ideological battles. In recent days, the press has mentioned her incessantly. Trump's spokesperson attacks Ilhan Omar, CNN or Levitt distorts the truth, sowing division. Washington Post, those sensational headlines don't surprise her. She's understood how this game operates since she was young. Growing up in the suburbs of New Hampshire, she witnessed the injustice of the media firsthand. Her former teacher, a conservative, was publicly vilified by the local paper simply for opposing a tax policy. Meanwhile, those with similar views but on the opposite side were celebrated as great activists. She remembers her mother's words at the dinner table as if they were spoken yesterday. You must speak up when the truth is being twisted. Now, standing before this crowd, Karoline is not just a spokesperson, she is a challenger to an entire system. Today's press conference is not just an event, it's an arena where truth and its interpretation are about to collide. And Karoline, with the composure of someone stepping into a final battle, is ready. Karoline Leavitt steps up to the podium, her gaze as cold and sharp as a freshly drawn sword. Inside her, a smoldering fire ignites. Not blind rage, but the determination of a warrior who has smelled the gunpowder on the battlefield of ideas. The reporters before her are not merely note-takers. They are opponents, wolves growling and ready to tear apart any word she utters, twisting it into a weapon. But she, too, is ready to turn their own blades into a devastating counterattack. Good afternoon, her voice rings out, clear and sharp, cutting through the stifling air. I know you've come here with prepared questions, so go ahead, ask. I'm not afraid to answer. A brief pause, her eyes locking onto the crowd like an unspoken challenge. First, she continues, her tone hardening like a hammer striking an anvil. If the media wants to crown itself the judge of outrage, then at least hold the scales of justice with both hands. She locks eyes with Peter from CNN, sitting in the front row, his gaze flickering with arrogant defiance. If I, a Republican, said, we need to fight in the streets, you'd demand my resignation, an investigation, maybe even jail time. But when Ilhan Omar says something similar, she pauses, letting the silence drive her point home. What do you call that? A call for democracy? Peter raises his hand, his voice sharp as a knife but trembling slightly at the end. Are you accusing Ilhan Omar of inciting violence? That's a serious accusation, Karoline. She tilts her head, her eyes narrowing like a leopard stalking its prey. Serious? No, Peter, it's cold, hard truth. I'm not accusing, I'm quoting, or are you planning to plug the ears of all of America to deny what she said? His silence is the answer she expected. Inside, she feels her heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from the thrill of seeing her opponent reveal their first weakness. She leans forward, her voice lowering, but cutting like a blade slicing through skin. When Democrats shout fight, you wrap it in silk and call it eloquence. But when a Republican so much as takes a deep breath, you turn it into a nuclear bomb threatening civilization. So tell me, Peter, what are the rules of this game? Or do the rules only exist to bind one side while letting the other run free? Peter opens his mouth, but she doesn't give him the chance. Don't answer. Your hesitation has already spoken for you. A reporter from NBC, a woman with a smooth but cunning tone, interjects. You can't seriously claim Omar wants to incite violence. She's just defending her community. Karoline whips around, her gaze blazing like a wildfire. Defending? When conservatives question the Biden administration, you label them domestic terrorists, a threat to be eradicated. But when Omar calls for fighting in the streets, that's defending? Don't insult me with that twisted logic. She slams her hand on the podium, the sound ringing out like a declaration of war. If you want to play the morality game, at least don't expose your blatant hypocrisy so blatantly. The press room falls deathly silent, but Karoline can feel the tension in every gaze. They came here to trap her, but now they're trembling before the sword she wields. Let's play a game, she says, her voice calm but icy like a predator laying a trap. If Trump were standing here today and said, "We need to take the fight to the streets," what would you do? No one dares to respond. She answers herself, her tone sharp as a hammer striking stone. You'd scream about impeachment, about civil war, about the apocalypse of democracy. Headlines would rain down like bombs. Trump incites violence. But when Ilhan Omar says the exact same thing, what do? Silence. So, where are your standards? In your wallets or in your loyalties? James from NBC, a seasoned journalist with a calm exterior but a piercing gaze, speaks up. Are you saying political outrage is selective? That's a serious accusation against our neutrality. Karoline lets out a sharp, cutting laugh, the sound slicing through the air like a knife. Neutrality? Don't make me laugh, James. I'm not accusing, I'm exposing. You forgive Omar like someone pardoning a naughty child, but with Trump, you dissect every breath as if he's the devil incarnate. If that's neutrality, then I'm the Queen of England. Peter from CNN jumps in, his voice irritable, like someone losing control. But what about context, Karoline? Omar talks about social struggle, about justice. Trump has a history of incitement. You can't pretend they're the same. Karoline leans forward, her gaze piercing him like a blade. Context? When Trump says peace and patriotism to make your voices heard, you twist it into a call for violence, building an entire media trial to hang him. But when Omar shouts we must fight in the streets, you demand context, metaphors, poetry? Don't insult my intelligence, Peter. This isn't about context. It's about who you want to protect and who you want to destroy. Silence blankets the room, heavy like the air before a storm. Then a phone rings, shattering the stillness. A reporter glances at their screen, eyes widening. Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you, they stammer. Karoline smirks, reaching for her iPad like a warrior picking up a sword. Of course she did. Hand it over, she commands, her voice icy. She reads the tweet aloud, each word dripping with sarcasm like a mocking jab. Karoline Leavitt spreads dangerous lies to cover up Trump's reckless agenda. Sound familiar? She looks up, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a verdict. She calls me a liar, but when she screams, "Fight in the streets," what's that, a prayer? A lullaby? Or just something you choose to ignore because it doesn't serve your narrative? James from the Washington Post tries to counterattack, his voice calm but sharp like someone hiding a knife behind their back. You quote Omar, but do you really believe she wants to incite violence? Or are you just twisting things for political points? Karoline tilts her head, her gaze burning into him like a flame. Believe? I don't need to believe, James. I have evidence. She said fight in the streets, not sing in the streets, not peaceful protests. If Trump uttered even half of that, you'd have demanded justice from him long ago. So don't ask me if I believe, just ask yourselves why you're blind to the obvious truth. Peter from CNN jumps in again, his voice nearly shouting, but Trump caused real violence, Karoline. January 6th is an undeniable stain. How dare you compare it to Omar's words? Karoline laughs, the sound cold and scornful, like a sword slashing through the air. A stain? Oh, Peter, how pathetic you are, clinging to that excuse. She scrolls through her iPad, her voice thundering like a storm. Here's Bernard Felix, attacking Republican volunteers, screaming they deserve to die. Here's the guy who threw Molotov cocktails at a GOP office, shouting he was following orders. And here, she pauses, letting the silence grow deadly, is the man who shot a Republican congressman on a baseball field, blood staining the grass. She slams the iPad onto the podium, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Tell me, Peter, are these real incidents? Or does violence only count when you can pin it on Trump? When a leftist picks up a gun, you stay silent. When Omar calls for fighting, you call it justice. But when Trump says resist, you turn it into a war. What kind of game is this, Peter? A game where truth only matters when it serves the winner? The press room falls silent. Karoline feels an electric surge run through her. Not fear, but sheer satisfaction as she watches them shrink before her decisive blow. A young reporter from MSNBC, voice trembling but trying to sound tough, speaks up. But you're cherry-picking to attack one side. Isn't it dangerous to pin all violence on Democrats? Karoline whips around, her gaze piercing like a spear. Cherry-picking? When Trump supporters are blamed for everything from protests to wildfires, what do you call that? When Omar screams fight in the streets, you demand broader context. But when Trump says peace, you turn it into war. Don't play the morality card with me. You're the masters of cherry picking. Silence engulfs the press room, heavy like the air before a fierce storm. Then a phone rings, tearing through the quiet. A reporter glances at their screen, eyes wide. Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you, they stammer. Karoline smirks, reaching for her iPad like a warrior lifting a sword. Of course she did. Hand it over, she commands, her voice cold as ice. She reads the tweet aloud, each word hissing through her teeth like a counteraccusation. Karoline Leavitt spreads dangerous lies to cover up Trump's reckless agenda. Sound familiar? She looks up, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a blade slicing across their throats. She calls me a liar? So when she screams, "Fight in the streets," what's that, a hymn? Or just something you deliberately plug your ears to avoid hearing? James from the Washington Post stands abruptly, his voice low but sharp as tempered steel, each word striking like a hammer. You play the quoting game well, Karoline, but don't play innocent with us. Trump doesn't just talk, he acts. January 6th wasn't a metaphor or an interpretation. It was 5 bodies lying cold on the ground, 140 police officers beaten bloody, and hundreds of families shattered by trauma that will never heal. I have a list right here. He raises a stack of documents, his voice rising like thunder. 57 people convicted just this week, all admitting Trump lit the fire in their heads. How dare you stand there and call that media spin? This isn't a word game. This is truth you can't brush off and deny. The press room erupts in murmurs, the tension stretching like a bowstring about to snap. Sarah from NBC jumps in, holding her phone, her voice sharp as a razor. And don't forget the stats, Karoline. The Justice Department in 2023, 70% of political attacks targeted Democrats and progressives. Only 20% targeted Republicans. Last week, Trump shouted, "Be strong. Don't let them steal our country." And a guy in Ohio smashed a Democratic office, quoting that exact line in court. What do you say to that? That we're making it up to smear Trump? Karoline's gaze doesn't waver. She sets the iPad on the podium, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. She takes a deep breath, her voice dropping low like a hammer ready to shatter everything. Blood and bodies, James? Stats and broken glass, Sarah? Fine, if you want to drag raw truth onto the table, I'll show you how raw it can get. She leans forward, her gaze blazing like a fire, consuming everything in its path. January 6th was a dark day. 5 dead, police bleeding, a stain no one can deny. But if you want to count bodies, don't do it halfway. In 2020, 30 lives vanished in the smoke and flames of riots. Not peaceful protests as you painted them, but cities burned to the ground, police pelted with bricks until their bones broke, and civilians trembling in their homes. Who fanned those flames? Not Trump, but Maxine Waters screaming, "Confront them in the streets," and Kamala Harris declaring they shouldn't stop while streets burned with Molotov cocktails. She slams her hand on the podium, the sound booming like thunder in a clear sky. You have 57 people from January 6th. I have 19 attacks on GOP offices from 2020. I have James Hodgkinson shooting Steve Scalise, blood staining the baseball field red. A congressman nearly dead, all incited by the anti-Trump rhetoric you championed. What do you call that, fiery justice? Or just deaths too inconvenient for you to exploit? She turns to Sarah, her voice sharp as a blade slicing through the air. And your stats, 70% or 20%. Don't make me laugh. Violence doesn't wear a party badge, but the way you count it does. Trump says be strong and you build a case against him. Biden calls half of America semi-fascist. Schumer threatens Supreme Court justices, saying they'll pay for it. And then what? No attackers quote them. No headlines scream their names. Why? Because you don't want them in the narrative you're crafting. Peter from CNN, nearly desperate, roars, "You talk about double standards, but Trump is the president. His words carry 1,000 times more weight. He must be held to a higher standard." Karoline leans forward, her gaze blazing like fire, consuming him. A higher standard? Then why don't you ask Biden when he calls Trump supporters semi-fascist, the scum of society? Why don't you ask Schumer when he threatens Supreme Court justices, saying they'll pay for it? Why don't you ask Hillary when she calls half of America deplorable? She pauses, her voice dropping like a death sentence. When a leftist shoots a Republican, you don't demand Democrats be held accountable. When someone attacks Kavanaugh's home, you don't dig into Schumer's words. But when Trump says resist, you build an entire crumbling empire around it. This isn't about accountability. It's about who you want to forgive and who you want to destroy. No one dares to respond. Karoline stands tall, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a general who has just claimed the battlefield. The truth is, she says, her voice firm as a nail driven in, echoing like a prophecy, you're not afraid of words. You're afraid of losing control. You're afraid of an America where people no longer bow to the narratives you construct. You're afraid of Trump not because of what he says, but because he represents something you can't control. The truth you can't distort. She taps the podium lightly, a smirk appearing like a final declaration of war. Next question. But deep down, she knows. This battle isn't just ending, it's opening the door to a larger war, and she's ready for it all. Peter from CNN, jaw clenched as if he's lost both his soul and his honor, roars one last time. Do you think you've won, Karoline? Americans will see you as an attacker of the truth. Karoline tilts her head, a smirk cutting like a final strike. Won? No, Peter, I'm not playing to win. I'm playing to expose. Americans don't need me to tell them the truth. They've seen it through every lie you've fed them. She slams her hand on the podium, the sound thundering like a storm. You're not afraid of me, not afraid of Trump. You're afraid of the day people stop believing the narratives you've built, and that day has begun. Without waiting for a response, she turns, stepping away from the podium with the poise of a warrior who has felled an enemy without looking back. The reporters' shouts erupt behind her, cameras flashing incessantly, but she doesn't stop. The door closes behind her with a sharp, definitive sound like a period at the end of a battle, but deep down, she knows. This is only the prelude. The real battle, the war of truth and power, has only just begun, and she will never back down. In a world where public opinion is shaped by the powerful, where those in control decide who is a hero and who is a villain, the truth becomes a luxury. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just waiting for those brave enough to speak it, even knowing they might be crushed by the very machine they're fighting against. Karoline isn't fighting to win a debate. She's fighting to expose the hypocritical game the media is playing, and when the truth is revealed, those who've grown accustomed to living in the shadows will tremble. As George Orwell once said, in an age of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. So what about you? In a world where narratives can be twisted to serve those who control them, will you stand silently and watch, or will you dare to stand up and ask questions? Remember, power doesn't lie with those who have the loudest voices. It belongs to those who dare to face the truth and refuse to bow. Are you ready for this war?